Perfect. Well, I think now that has actually just let everyone in. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the M365 Security and Data Protection webinar. What we're going to do is we're going to give it a quick 30 seconds to a minute just to make sure everyone joins and doesn't miss anything out. But yeah, hopefully everyone can hear me okay. If you can't, then just pop a quick message in the chat box. If you also half dying because of the heat in your office, you can also complain about that on the chat. I don't mind. I think Bruce and I are pretty much in the same situation here. I can slowly see the temperature rise up next to me, which is probably a bad idea, having a thermometer right next to my desk and watching that slowly climb. Anyway, we will of course gloss over that, and I will try not to bring it up for the duration of this event. So give it about 20 seconds or so, just let everyone join in, and it seems like, yeah, a couple of people are in fact still joining, so awesome. And for those of you that have joined, welcome, good morning. You are on the webinar for the M365 Security and Data Protection, so I'm assuming that you are in the right place. Awesome. So I think now is a good time to kick off. So again, good morning, everyone. Today we are talking around the M365 Security and Data Protection. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Fire exits are the long-standing joke because of COVID. Hopefully, this will be one of the last. Well, I say last. One of the fewer online sessions where we can slowly start moving back to face-to-face sessions, given that Freedom Day has just passed. In terms of today, it's a bit more of I'd say an interactive session. Please do, throw questions in. There is a Q&A section towards the end where Bruce and I can answer those types of questions. This event, of course, is recorded. The links will be sent out tomorrow or even the day after, so you can, watch it at your leisure. So if you do need to pop out, if you do need to drop out halfway through, this will, of course, be sent to you. We'll also be sending out a feedback form following this webinar. Feedback is always encouraged. It's always good to hear, some really good feedback. Likewise, we always want to know, where we can improve. So in terms of today, just to do a bit of an introduction of our speakers. So you have myself, Gennaro Miaccio. So I am the Head of Solutions Development here at Bytes. I suppose that's the fancy way of saying that I wear many hats across the business, but my main focus really is, investigating and building out solutions that we propose to our customers. My background is in security, and prior to that, Microsoft. So definitely have that technical background and experience. Now today I'm joined by Bruce Knight. So Bruce Knight is our pre-sales security consultant. The way that I tend to describe Bruce is one of our Microsoft veterans. He has got a really good background in all things Microsoft Cloud, with a very strong understanding on the security elements within Microsoft. Bruce is, very technical, very hands-on, to the point where I actually pinch his test environments because they are very configured. Again, Bruce, cannot thank you enough for that. Your Sentinel instance has definitely done me well over the last couple of weeks / months. So, in terms of today's session, I guess in terms of the objective for today, it's really to share some knowledge on DLP in general, as well as exploring the key security and compliance capabilities that are available within the Microsoft Cloud that relate to DLP controls. Now, DLP of course is everywhere. It touches on numerous different elements of IT. So hopefully, we can fulfill that objective. And by way of agenda and of course structuring that, done a quick round of introductions. I'm going to do a very quick overview on the Bytes security capability, as well as giving an overview into DLP. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Bruce, where he's going to bring up his demo instance on the Microsoft side to actually talk us through some of the DLP capabilities that we have in Microsoft, including the endpoint and Teams DLP side. Finally, and to close off, we'll quickly touch on the compliance and data governance workshops that we have as well as opening up the floor for a little bit of QA. So hopefully that's all in line with everyone's expectations today. So jumping straight in, just wanted to give a very quick overview in terms of where Bytes sit on the security side. So just bring up the next slide. I suppose when talking through this, I tend to start off on the right-hand side, the procurement services, and a lot of you are, I would assume, are quite familiar with Bytes. We are, renowned for our license and procurement capabilities, and over time we have definitely grown and evolved, our security offerings all round. And I suppose whilst the procurement services is very important in terms of licensing and actually understanding, okay, what the vendors such as Microsoft have to offer, the next stage to that is, of course, just as important, the professional services side. And this is more around, the delivery of these technologies that we've procured, so we can actually realize a quicker time to value. We have seen how much we get from the Microsoft suites. There is a lot. If any of you today are on the M365 E3 or even E5, you know that you get an abundance of features, an abundance of components, and the main next step is, of course, to switch this on and realize the value. So Bytes can, of course, provide those types of professional services. The next step to that, of course, is there are a lot of components. Some of these components we can fire and forget. The other components we need to be a little bit more hands-on to, and this is exactly where our managed services come in. So, once we've actually delivered, some of these components and solutions, how do we offset some of the overhead that these technologies come with? How can we realize, better value by putting the correct people and processes behind that? So again, Bytes offer a number of managed services to ensure your solutions are being resourced correctly and value is actually being realized from these. And finally, we have our cyber consulting division. Everything tends to loop back towards the cyber consulting side because this deals with more of the strategy and audit elements of cyber. So our cyber consulting division helps to provide that strategy, audit, and advisory, as well as things like assurance services, like pen testing and digital forensics and incident management. Should any of our clients ever suffer a breach. So all in all, we have got a very strong security capability all round. We've also got a 24/7 support desk, which underpins that. In terms of the security space, we have evolved on from just licensing. So hopefully that gives a nice overview in terms of what we can deliver as Bytes. Anyway, I'd say onto the main content now. We're here to talk about data today. We are here to talk about DLP and how much of a beast it is. So I suppose whenever starting off on any kind of data conversation, the main thing to go through is data is exploding, or well, actually, this is probably a tad incorrect. Data has exploded. It is literally everywhere at the moment. It's created, stored, and shared in a variety of different services. A lot of you will probably remember that in the past, the only data that we really had to deal with was our email system, our file share, and maybe something like a CRM system. Now data can be saved in loads of different applications. It can be structured and unstructured. We've got loads of different cloud services, both on the personal and corporate side. Like data is absolutely everywhere, and being able to manage this effectively always becomes a challenge, but also the risks associated with any of that data being leaked. So how do we look to avoid some of this? How do we look to minimize some of the risk? And this is exactly where data loss prevention tends to come in. So as mentioned, DLP kind of sits everywhere within the security side. I would say traditionally, a while back when talking around DLP, a lot of people have associated this to just email. Whilst email DLP still exists and is still powerful, DLP now encompasses data itself, right? And this could be anything via chat IMs on mobile devices or even via websites. So there's a lot of areas that we need to consider, but we need to be aware of what we're actually trying to do here, which is we're trying to protect that data. we're protecting that data that's in use, in motion, and also at rest. So no matter where that data resides, we need to protect that. In order to achieve this, it's not normally a single solution that can achieve this, or if it is a single solution, we need to normally look at, a process to go behind, the DLP side to ensure that our data, is safe. And again, as mentioned, it does span across multiple areas of IT. So because of this, there's always a lot to consider on the DLP side. So much so that we tend to find that DLP projects are massive, scary, and I guess a lot of people probably put them on the back burner just given the sheer complexity of it. But why do we need to do this? The risks of not having these types of controls in place. I mean, I could literally write out a list of risks longer than my arm, but I've been told to only focus on the main ones. So first and foremost, if our data is lost from a company, there's going to be that loss of trust. No one wants to be that company that's lost data. Word travels fast, and of course that segues quite nicely into the second point, which is reputational damage. We've all seen the news, we've all been on LinkedIn, we've all seen those organizations that have had data breaches or data leakages, and the reputational damage that they suffer. Now, if these 2 points weren't enough to damage a business, the third one is definitely going to be the nail in the coffin, which are fines. There are a lot of fines out there, quite hefty fines that, of course, can really put a dent on the bottom line of a business. So data protection needs to be a focus. But again, it is also a big thing. It's a big project. There is loads of different facets of data within the organization. So let's talk around a bit of a DLP strategy. Now, I've used this strategy, I guess, a couple of times when consulting with, a couple of clients and customers. For me, DLP always starts out with our objective. What are we trying to do? Of course, we're trying to protect data, but to what level? To what data are we looking to protect? Where are our crown jewels? And of course, most importantly, how many devices, cloud apps, internal apps, line of business apps do we actually have that holds that data? What's the scope of this? Once we ascertain what that scope is and what we're trying to do, we can then actually start to do something about it. I guess the first thing that we want to do about it is do that discovery piece. There is no point in throwing loads of DLP controls at something without actually understanding where our business critical data is and where our sensitive data is. So we need to do that data inventory. We need to do that data discovery piece to really understand, okay, we've got some data in SharePoint, some data on our file share, some data in OneDrive or an Azure storage account, and we can start inventorying this. Once we have that inventory, we can actually conduct a risk assessment of that data. How secure is it in each of those locations? What controls do we have in those locations? And also, what would happen if data from one of those locations are leaked? So we can actually start asking these questions to build out a risk register based on, what would happen if that data was leaked. Once we understand that, once we understand where our data is and what the potential impact can be, we can then start putting some controls around that. We can start to say, okay, a majority of our sensitive information is over here and it's accessed by these people, and we never want the data leaving our boundary. Because of this, we now need to put that control in place. And most of the time when we look at DLP controls, it's all around how do we know where that data travels to? Does it go inside the organization only? Does it go outside of the organization? Does it have the capability of going outside the organization? So putting those control means in place is absolutely key. And then finally, which is the last step of the strategy, is just to review that. DLP is not a one-hit wonder. It's not a fire and forget by any means. This is going to, of course, loop around all the time. We're going to review that. We're going to go back to the drawing board. We're going to redo our discovery. We're going to continuously do our risk assessments, and we're going to, tinker with those controls that we put into place to ensure that our data is being protected. Hopefully, I haven't brain dumped too much on everyone. Hopefully that gives a good understanding of what a DLP strategy would typically look like, again from high level of course, but again, that is an approach that we've generally seen. In terms of seeing this, I guess, in a little bit more practice, I will hand over to Bruce. Bruce, I'm hoping that you're still there and you haven't haven't switched off over my waffling around DLP. But Bruce, if you wouldn't mind taking the floor to take us through the DLP capabilities within the Microsoft side.
Yeah, still here. Thanks, Gennaro. Just let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah, I can see the compliance dashboard on the Microsoft side.
Cool. Great, thanks. And thanks for teeing up the demo session for me. I think, certainly done a great job in defining why it's good to understand the type of data you have in your organization. But let's have a look now at how you can actually put some of that into practice. So I'll go through a couple of components as part of the demo, and we'll focus in on, I guess, the Endpoint Dlp capabilities because it's fairly new. I think obviously SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, DLP has been around for some time in Microsoft 365 land. And then we'll also look at how you can implement Teams DLP. But naturally, the great thing about DLP in the compliance center is that you can create Dlp policies and then apply them across locations and services in Microsoft 365, but also extend that out to other SaaS applications if you want to, or even now the new capability that they've brought in to be able to look at on-premise content as well and create Dlp policies to apply against on-prem file shares or SharePoint on-premise as well. So as part of that, I'll show you, those other locations and how you can add those pieces in. Sometimes it makes more sense to have Dlp policies for every specific service, or break them out, and sometimes it may make sense for you to include multiple locations. But we'll work through those as part of the demo. So I'll jump into it now, and the place to get started obviously is the Compliance Center. So compliance.microsoft.com. And if you start in here, you'll be able to, obviously the dashboard will show up and you'll get some high level data in here. But before we go into how do we discover data inside those different services that we spoke about, the first thing we want to be able to do is make sure that we've onboarded devices so that we can take advantage of the Endpoint Dlp policies and capabilities. So as soon as you onboard a device into the Compliance Center, you can start to audit and have a look at some of the activities that are happening on those endpoints. And so once you start to get that data, you can then start to define some of your Dlp policies. So you can first monitor, I guess, some of those activities, and then once you're ready to create Dlp policies based on what you see and have discovered, you can then start to create those policies. So if we go into compliance.microsoft.com, go to settings, and there's device onboarding here, and this is where you can onboard devices into the Compliance Center. If you already use Defender for Endpoint, you'll be able to easily get started with onboarding devices in the Compliance Center. So it'll literally show up in here. It's the same process that you'd use to onboard devices into Defender for Endpoint that you would for the Compliance Center. Obviously, you don't need Defender for Endpoint licenses to be able to onboard devices into the Compliance Center, but you would need Endpoint Dlp licenses, so part of compliance add-ons, info and protection add-ons, and different ways that you can obviously purchase Endpoint Dlp and Teams Dlp, for example. But certainly, if you have already started to use things like Defender for Endpoint, makes things a little bit easier because it's already good to go. So you'll see devices show up here once they're onboarded, but once if you want to get started and you haven't got any devices showing up yet in here, you'll see that the methods to deploy and onboard devices, you can use group policy, you can use a local script. It's very similar for Defender for Endpoint, or if you're like me, you could use the Microsoft Endpoint Manager. There's a link to go click on there, but it's really quick and easy to set up and start to onboard devices if they're enrolled into Intune. But certainly, different methods to get devices up and running and showing in the Compliance Center. And once they're in here, you'll then start to see those activities from endpoints that have enrolled in the Activity Explorer, but well, more on that a little bit later. I'll jump in and show you the kinds of activities you'll start to see once you've onboarded devices. But let's start off with, I guess as Gennaro mentioned, the big piece to this is to be able to discover data, and to discover data, I guess you need to know what type of information you're looking for in your organization. So understanding the type of data that you need to discover is obviously key to that. And there are different ways that you can start to look for and find that content within Microsoft 365. So, of course, the first piece is we want to have a look at is sensitive info types. So there's lots of out-the-box sensitive information types that are available for you to go out and start discovering on. And if we have a look at, there's over 200 out-the-box ones that you can take advantage of. Obviously, some of those probably won't be relevant for your organization, but if you want to have a look at specific ones, I guess, relating to the UK, you can narrow down your search and you'll see there's a couple of really relevant UK-based sensitive info types: driver's license, national insurance numbers, passport numbers. So you can go out and discover data based on these. But most of the time, I'm assuming you'd also want to be able to create your own sensitive information types. So, perhaps data that's unique to your organization that's not covered by one of these existing sensitive info types. And so it's fairly easy to go and create your own new sensitive info type. So if I click on create, you'll see I give it a friendly name. So for example, if I wanted to go out and discover employee data, like employee numbers, for example, so I want to go find where there's content that has employee numbers for Contoso. So I work in an organization called Contoso, and I want to see who and where people are storing data that contains employee numbers. And so I have a good understanding, I guess, on what an employee number looks like. So should be able to go out and create a sensitive info type. And just for an example, I've got a Word document here. It's got a couple of employee numbers in it. So a couple of letters and then some numbers. This document's got some others that won't really match on a Dlp policy, depending on how I've set up my sensitive info types. But that's kind of how our Contoso employee numbers look like. So I can get started with creating my own sensitive. So if I go in here, let's just call it employee numbers demo, give it a nice description. And then we can start to define the type of pattern it needs to match on. And so there's lots of different ways you can do this. Obviously, the first piece here is to define what type of confidence level this pattern would match on. So I'd say if you've got primary elements and supporting elements, then you'd want to set it as high confidence. But if you're just going to do maybe a single primary element to match on, so I'm going to do fairly basic sensitive info type here. So I'd match that to low confidence. But if you are going to add supporting contents, you can move this up to medium or high confidence, and it all depends on how many supporting elements you have with that. And there's a whole write-up on how best to create these sensitive info types. But you'll see here, if I drop down now to my primary elements, there's different ways that I can create this using regular expression, which would probably be a good way for me to match my employee numbers. But if there's specific words that you want to match on, then you could use keyword list or keyword dictionaries, or you could look at functions as well, and you probably use that in combination maybe with regular expressions. But let's have a look at regex. And so in here, I can give it a name. So we want to create employee numbers, maybe give it a good name. And so, I mean, I'm just going to be really basic here. Obviously, regular expressions can get quite complex, and there's a whole sort of way to write these things up. And if you want to learn a bit more, you'll see there's a little link there to learn a little bit more about regex patterns. But I'm not going to get into the detail there. I'm just going to create one. I know it's got two letters. There's a hyphen, and then there's 6 numbers following that. So, I'm going to go really basic on this one and just start off with. It's going to be A to Z, and we'll close that off. And that I know is 2 letters, so just put 2, and then we have a hyphen, and then we're going to say that it's between 0 to 9 for the next piece, and that consists of Was it 6? So then we'll close it off. So really basically it's going to look for something that's going to have A to Z for 2 characters, a hyphen, and then 6 letters following that. So obviously you might get quite a few false positives just doing something like this. So you probably want to define that a little bit more, add some validators, add additional elements to it. But like I say, you can fine tune and tweak those as you start to learn a little bit more about sensitive info types and regular expressions. So I've already created one exactly like this. But once you create it, you can also go out and test it to make sure that your regular expressions that you have created have worked properly. So I'll go to my existing regular expression that's already been created. And I can quickly find that under employee numbers. So if I wanted to test it, you literally just click test, upload your document, so either a Word doc or a text file, and it'll show you if it's matched or not. So if you're happy that it's working, then you can start to use that sensitive info type in things like Dlp policies, in information protection labels, retention labels, so that that becomes available to you across the compliance center suite of products. So once I've created and defined what that type of information is that I'm looking for, the next piece that I want to do is discover that data, right? So there's different ways that I can do that. Obviously, the natural place you probably want to go and have a look to would be content search or e-discovery. And so if you go into content search, obviously you can go in here and just search for data, and you might define specific parameters around your search, but you can do a search on a sensitive info type. Unfortunately, when you use content search, so if I was looking for employee numbers, for example, and I wanted to use that sensitive info type that I've just created, I've probably got one that's already called that. You can use the sensitive info or the sensitive type parameter. There is something to be aware of, though. If you're looking at content search to find that content, and using a sensitive info type, you'd have to only search that on SharePoint sites. It doesn't support Exchange mailboxes, so you'll notice if you do turn on Exchange mailboxes and try to search that location using a sensitive type search command, it won't work on Exchange mailboxes. You'll just find tons of data that's not relevant. But it works perfectly well in SharePoint and OneDrive. So if I switch this on for SharePoint and OneDrive and I want to find documents and content that includes that sensitive info that I was talking about, I can include that. I'm not going to look on-prem. And in here, I can add my keywords. So for example, if I was to, wanted to find all credit card information, I could go in and type sensitive type : credit card number, or any sensitive type that's out the box that you saw in that list. If you're going to use one of your custom parameters, so that employee number one that I created, you can't just put in employee number there. You have to find the sensitive type ID, which you can use, which you can get by using the get Dlp sensitive information type PowerShell commandlet. And once you get that unique ID, you have to copy that in here instead of using the actual name. But if you're going to use out the box ones, you can just copy and paste the name of that sensitive info type. If not, you'd use the ID that you can get from PowerShell commandlet. And so from there, I'll just go next and submit that, and that'll go out and discover all data that contains my newly created sensitive info type in SharePoint and OneDrive. And so just for obviously the sake of time, I've already created one. And in here, you'll see that it's picked up a couple of items. I can go look at the search statistics. It'll tell me it's found some items in different locations. So a nice sort of summary of where that sensitive info is. And I can go and have a look at the top locations, how many items. So in different SharePoint sites, there's some in a personal site in OneDrive. And so it's discovered some data. And I can go and have a look at a sample of that data or export it out and hand it over to somebody if they need to go through and have a look at the data. But so, fairly effective way to find that data using content search. Of course, as mentioned, it's not going to go in and look, it can't find sensitive info type information in Exchange mailboxes, unfortunately. You could use other search parameters to find specific content in Exchange and other locations, but if you're going to use a sensitive info type, then this is going to work for SharePoint and OneDrive. And then here I can click on one of the search parameters, download the documents, let's see what that document looks like, and I can open it up, and there's that document that contains that sensitive info type. So if we close out of content search, there is a nice new tool as well that you can leverage. So if we go back to data classification, you'll see that under the data classification piece here, there are a couple of new features that have been out for a couple of months now. But Content Explorer is also a great way that you can go and just discover data, I guess, based on those sensitive info types. So you know, out the box ones plus the custom ones. So you have the employee numbers. And the great thing about this is it includes the exchange location as well. So if I wanted to, find all credit card number information, I could click to credit card numbers and then start to explore content and data in those different locations. But we want to have a look at our employee numbers. So if I click on employee numbers, I can then jump into either OneDrive or SharePoint. It does have a little information bar at the top here saying that the OneDrive piece is in preview. And so maybe a little bit inconsistent. I haven't found it too bad. It pretty much seems to be okay for me at the moment. So if I jump into OneDrive, for example, and I wanted to find any content based on my sensitive info types, there it shows, there's some files that I found through content search. But I could go back and have a look at Exchange as well through this Content Explorer, and I can see there is some content in Miriam's mailbox and in Megan's mailbox, and I can jump in and explore that a little bit more. So have a look at Content Explorer. It might help supplement your data discovery needs. And just another way for you to go and explore content and find, either sensitive information types. You could go, just click back to all locations, sensitive info types, or you could look or search for content that contains a specific sensitivity label. So if you've created information protection labels, and you started to apply those to content in your organization, you could go in and say, I want to find all content that's been marked with internal label or a general label or confidential label, and it'll narrow it down to those different locations, and you can drill into the detail a little bit more from there. Or specifically retention labels as well. So you'll be able to go and find labels that have been marked with retention labels for PII, confidential, or any of those labels that you've created and applied. So great tool to go and discover and search for data. Another great tool that's been made available is Activity Explorer. And as I mentioned earlier, once you've onboarded your endpoints into the Compliance Center, you'll start to see a lot of endpoint activities. So you'll see here, I've got some, couple of different activities in here. And a lot of this has been filtered in by the endpoint specifically. So you'll see that I can drop down activity and have a look at different types of activities that I want to explore on. So, maybe I want to find DLP rules that have been matched or files that have been created or printed. So lots of different activities that I can narrow down on. But maybe I just want to go out now and have a look at just the endpoint activities. And so I can search and narrow that down to endpoints. Maybe a specific user that I want to find activity on, or if I want to go and look at a specific label and activity just for that label on those endpoints. So if we search now and narrow it down to endpoint, I can go and see here that there's been, some files copied to clipboards that I've obviously, I could create some Dlp policies to block files from being copied to clipboard or content, files that have been created, files that have been modified, label change. So somebody's changed a sensitivity label from highly confidential to general, for example, and I can click into the detail here and it'll tell me what happened in the specific. So there was a label downgrade, and the justification that was given by the end user was incorrect label. It was done manually, and I can see that the sensitivity label now is general, but the old sensitivity label was highly confidential. So lots of great information that you can pick up from this Activity Explorer. And it's a great place for you to start exploring first, right? So before you go and create your DLP policies to actually block any of these activities, so for example, files being copied to removable media, you'll see there's lots of information that you get. So at the moment I've got an enforcement mode of WARN, the details of the file that was copied across, where it was copied from and to, and then the actual removable media, disk drives, SanDisk, UltraFit, the serial number, so all the detail and data that you'd need to do some investigation about what is happening on those endpoints. And so once you discover and understand that content, I guess it's then time to go out and have a look at creating those DLP policies to actually control that information and block it from being copied across or being printed or any of those activities, or being copied into a Teams channel chat conversation, or being shared out from SharePoint or OneDrive, or being emailed out via Exchange, right? So DLP covers a broad scope of different services, but let's have a look at those in a little bit more detail. So I'll jump back to the Compliance Manager. Just going to refresh that. It looks to be rendering a bit strange. So let's go to data loss prevention. And over here, you'll see when you jump into the DLP page, some great information here to get started with. If you're not too familiar with how to create DLP policies, go and read these documents. A couple of activities, just summary for me that I can have a look at. Policies is where we go out and create those policies, and we'll jump in and create one in a minute. Alerts, these are all the alerts that get triggered based on those DLP policies that you've created. And so this is a great place. Obviously, you can create notifications as part of your policies to email specific individuals when a DLP policy is triggered. But I can also jump into that specific alert and get lots of information about which DLP policy was matched. Who was it that triggered that DLP policy, assign it to somebody to investigate. So lots of information that I can get from the view details pane as well here. Yeah, you can see I can change the status. Something wrong with my demo. Investigating, dismissed, resolved, add some comments, save that, assign it to somebody. But you'll see there's plenty of information for you to understand why that DLP policy was triggered. What was the information, what sensitive info types were included, what locations, the time, and so lots of great information that you can go and start to have a look at in more detail. If you click on events, you can drill into the detail a little bit more for each specific event that would trigger that DLP policy. Once again, which sensitive info types and metadata and all kinds of other content that you can get from these DLP alerts. Endpoint Dlp Settings. So this is where you want to go and configure. So once you've onboarded your devices through settings that I showed you a little bit earlier, you want to come in here to Endpoint Dlp Settings and start to set up and configure some of these specific settings. So file path inclusions, if you want to exclude specific paths from on those endpoints, so they won't trigger DLP policies or monitor activities in those specific file paths, you can add exclusions. Unallowed apps. So this is where you can go out and add apps that you want to prevent specific apps from accessing protected content or files. So you add them in here. You can click here, and if you have ones that have been discovered, you can just click on, or you can add the executable name and app. Unallowed Bluetooth apps, browser and domain restrictions. So this is where you can define which browsers are not allowed to access sensitive information. So I pretty much added every single one in here, except obviously for the Edge browser. So if I try to open up content that includes sensitive information like employee numbers in a Chrome browser, it will block me from being able to do that, or Firefox or any of these other ones. But I can add and edit this list, maybe take them out. Maybe I want to remove Chrome and allow you to still use Chrome, or add specific browsers through there as well. The other piece you probably want to have a look at is it's domain services. You can either have an allow or block list of service domains. So this is where you can control whether sensitive files protected by your policies can be uploaded into these domains. So you might want to control this via an allow or block only specific types of domains. So up to you on how you want to set up and configure these service domains. Additional settings for Endpoint Dlp. This is where you set up those business justification policy tips. So when a DLP policy gets triggered on the endpoint, you can have it show up a drop-down list of different sort of options for them to choose from. and this is where you can go and define these different options and how that sort of is visible from an end user, and we'll get to that end user experience in a little bit. And then there's always audit file activity for devices. So as mentioned, once you onboard devices, it will start to audit that activity, and you can go and view that in Activity Explorer. If you don't want that to happen, you can turn it off here and only trigger activities based on DLP policies that you've created. So if you want to turn it off, this is where you do that. So let's go out now and, oh, sorry, one last piece. Activity Explorer is to put it in here as well. It's the same Activity Explorer that you see when you go through data classification, but it's nice to be able to quickly look through, you know, Activity Explorer, I guess, in here, and then go and define some policies based on the back of some of the activities you're seeing on endpoints, for example. So if I go into policies now and I want to create a DLP policy, if you new to DLP policies, I'd say start off with one of the predefined templates and maybe tweak and adjust those. And then once you get more confident with creating DLP policies, you can get into custom, but you can filter based on a specific region, for example. And I can go and maybe start off with just looking for and protecting UK financial data. Depending on the industry, there's different options here. And but we'll go out and create a custom one because we want to create DLP policies based on that sensitive info type that I created for employee numbers. So I'll go custom policy, and here give it a name, obviously, that makes sense, and a description, and then locations to apply the policy. And so, as mentioned, there's lots of locations that you can apply DLP policies against. So Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive. It's good to note that these are all included in E3 plan. If you start to use Teams, chat and channel messages, devices, MCAS, on-premise repositories, then that's part of E5, or there's specific add-ons that you can get to be able to leverage this functionality. Teams and channel messages, that's pretty self-explanatory. Somebody posts a chat in a team chat or channel message. Devices, that we've had a look at some of those activities, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But you can use Microsoft Cloud App Security to extend DLP into other SaaS applications like Salesforce or Dropbox or OneDrive, OneDrive Personal, or wherever. So not OneDrive Personal, but other integrated SaaS apps that you've integrated into Microsoft Cloud App Security. And then the new one here, on-premise repositories. This is where you can leverage an on-premise DLP scanner, so leveraging ARP, like similar to that ARP scanning capabilities, to go out and look at the content that you have in file shares and in SharePoint on-premise, and then also extend activities to block maybe access to files that it finds in those SharePoint repositories. So that could be things like, you just want to block people from accessing it if it finds employee numbers or whatever other sensitive info type that you create as part of that DLP policy, or maybe once it finds that content, it needs to set a specific permission on that file or inherit the root folder permissions, or to remove the file from an improper location and send that to a quarantine folder, for example. So lots of great actions that you can take from an on-premise repository perspective. And so this is a fairly new capability that's come out, but go and have a look at that if you're interested. So I would say, though, that if there are some specific settings that you won't be able to leverage if you just go and turn on all these sources and want to configure a DLP policy, because there's specific actions or conditions that you could set that might differ from these different services. So and also maybe there's different notification people that you want to include. So sometimes, like I said, it might make sense to have them for all, or you might want to just target specific services and then create different ones for these different locations. But we're going to focus in on Teams, channel, chats, messages, and devices. So for example, if I included both of these, when I go and look at the specific conditions and what type of information I wanted to match on, I'd be able to look for sensitive info types, but I wouldn't be able to match on sensitivity labels if I included both of these. But if I just did devices, then I could also include, sensitive info types as well as sensitivity labels, but that's not supported in Teams chat and channel message because you're not going to have a file in a chat. It's all about what's being put into that chat message. Obviously, there's content stored in SharePoint that you'd upload into a team, but that would be covered in SharePoint Dlp policy. But in a channel and chat message, it's about text data, right? So you can't label something that you just type into a chat message, and that's why it's not supported as part of a team and chat channel message. But sensitive info types are. So depending on what capability you need to look at, you might want to tweak or change or just target one specific point here. But we could go to next, and then we create a rule to match on. And so this is for employee numbers. And you can have multiple rules as part of the Dlp policy. You might have a low volume match that's just notify and not block, and then a high volume match. So if it finds 5 or more or 10 or more, then block that activity or actions. So you'll see a rule consists of conditions, exceptions, actions, notifications, user overrides. So if you want the ability for the user to override that, and alerts as well. So lots of different components to a Dlp policy. As mentioned, for conditions, we can only add sensitive info types here. But if I was targeting just devices, then I could go and choose sensitive labels as well. So if I wanted to do something specifically to files and content that had a sensitivity label applied, I could add those in. But yeah, I could go in and find my employee number. Let's do a search. Here it is. And you can have multiple sensitive info types to match. It's up to you on how you want to create these, or have separate ones for different types. Exceptions, if there's specific exceptions you want to add. Actions, so this is where we go out and define what happens when it finds that content that we're matching on that sensitive info type. And so we might want to restrict access to that content. And so there's different parameters here, and some of these are obviously only specific to SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams content. And so we could block or restrict access, but we could also then, if you've included devices, this is where you go out and set audit and restrict activities on Windows devices. And so we can go up here and set audit only or block. So there's different activities that we can do this across. So uploading to cloud services. So if user tries to upload into Google Drive or Dropbox or OneDrive or those cloud services, copy to clipboard, copy to USB removable drive, so content that is moved across to a USB drive that includes sensitive info type that I've defined, copy to network shares, access by unallowed apps. So we had a look at where you can define those unallowed apps. Printing activities, so if the user opens a document that contains that employee number and they try to print it, transfer via Bluetooth. And then also remote desktop services. So if they're in a remote desktop service session and they try to copy to that host, then you can block or audit or block with override. So you always have these 3 choices here, and you can decide whether you want to give the users the ability to have an override option, and then if they override, what business justifications can they choose. And so in here you can go and define what those are. And just for the purpose of time as well, actually I've created already Dlp policies across the board here. But once you've created your rules, you can then go, the next step is to test or turn on the policy. The first time you've created, you probably want to you don't want to turn it on straight away, you want to test that. So if you put it into like the test mode, you'll get those sort of activity reports. You can go in and see where files have been triggered in the alerts piece, and you'll get the notifications by email depending on what you've set up over there. And then, once you've defined or happy with your Dlp policy, so you might want to go back in, fine tune the policy, add some additional supporting elements to your sensitive info types, tweak it. And when you're happy with the way it's working, you can go and turn it on. Obviously, make users aware through comms before you just, turning these kinds of things on. But there will be policy tips showed to end users as well when they're accessing sensitive information. So that will help in terms of user visibility. But now let's go and have a look at what that end user experience looks like. So, you've created your Dlp policies, you've applied them across those sources. And so, for example, now I'm on an endpoint that is covered and been onboarded. And I've got this document here that's called Contoso employee numbers. It's got employee numbers on that I've defined as part of the sensitive info type. And if I go here now, for example, and I want to print this document, I'm just going to print to PDF, but it could be printed in my home office or at the office, for example. And it's popped up to say, hey, because I put here audits or block with or warn with override. And so I can still allow this to happen, but I have to put in a business justification. If I just block only, obviously the only option I'd have would be to dismiss this alert, and I wouldn't be able to print it. But I could say my manager has approved this action, and add something in. Hopefully that's not the real reason, and allow that to still happen. So once I've put in my business justification, and then I go and try and print this document, I'll be able to print that document out. So we'll just save that, and it works no problem. And so once I've obviously, there's a couple of other activities that I wanted to show you as well. So that's print. Obviously, let's see if we can open this in Chrome, for example. So that was one of the blocked browsers. So if I go and try and open that into Chrome, it won't let me open it in Chrome, and I get the same sort of message here, but I can only dismiss that, so I have no option actually overriding that. Let's see what happens if we try and take some of this content and copy it off into a USB drive. So let's take employee numbers and contost employee numbers, a Word doc, and let's copy that and paste that into a USB drive. So if we try and copy that across, that pops up. I can dismiss or take action. I'm just going to dismiss that. And let's have a look as well if somebody tries to take this content and upload it into, say, Google Drive, for example. So let's have a look at taking the same documents. And let's try and move this. Oh, sorry. Let's go back to Google and drag that down in there. Let's see. And it blocks me from being able to copy it into Google Drive. And obviously, if I had to try and add a new file this way, file upload, and try and choose that same document and upload that, should hopefully get the same message blocking me from being able to do that. So certainly seems like the DLP policy is all working as intended, and of course as these are getting triggered, this will pop up in Activity Explorer or create the alerts. You'll get the notifications that you've defined in your DLP policies, so you can then take action based on these activities and alerts that have happened as part of your DLP policy. But obviously if you set them to block only, you've effectively been able to protect that information from being moved onto USB, being printed, being copied into cloud storage, and so lots of those activities covered from an endpoint DLP perspective. The other piece we wanted to quickly have a look at was obviously Teams chat and channel conversations. So same goes here. If I take a employee number, for example, or any of those sensitive info types that you defined, and I wanted to copy and paste that into a chat message with Alex or in a team channel conversation, the DLP policy will kick in once I've copied or typed in that sensitive information. Get a little message saying, hey, this message was blocked. As an end user, I can click on what can I do, and this is that same override capability. Obviously, once again, if you don't want to have overrides, you can not give the option here, so that maybe only be able to report it to an admin, but I can have an override if I want, and put in something hopefully that's meaningful, and then it will then obviously open that up so that I can still put that message to Alex or in the channel conversation. So that's then the experience from a Teams DLP perspective and endpoint. Obviously across Exchange, you'll see policy tips and be blocked from sending email, OneDrive and SharePoint. If I had to copy a file with employee numbers into, say, a SharePoint document library that's been shared externally or has external guest access, I can have that blocked so that only internal users can view it and no external users, or maybe only the owner can view it and no one else. So even if they have access to a document library that I copied that file into, the DLP policy will kick in and block access to it from, they wouldn't even see it in the document library. So it would only be visible to the owner or to the owner and internal, depending on how you've defined your DLP policy. And I think that just about covers off the demo. Hopefully it's given you a little bit more insight into how some of the DLP policies and capabilities work and how to discover some content in your organization. Back to you, Gennaro.
Thank you so much for that, Bruce. That's definitely comprehensive and a lot more on the DLP side from Microsoft than I remember. It seems like every time I put Office 365 down for about 2 to 3 months, I come back to it and there's always something new. So no, really, thank you so much for that run through. It's very good to see it for myself. Now, I'm not sure if my screen is showing. If it is, oh, there we go. I'm assuming, Bruce, can you still see my slide deck?
Give me 1 second.
I'm hoping that's still be.
Right, there we go. Yeah, it's time now.
Yeah, awesome, perfect. So conscious of time, so of course we'll try and flow through this as quickly as possible. But I mean, I suppose in terms of next steps, again, thank you, Bruce, for taking us through that. I think it goes without saying that 30 minutes to actually run through the capabilities that Microsoft has does not do it justice, right? There seems to be a lot to it. As mentioned, every couple of months, there's always something being added. There's always something being improved. It's always, it's forever being extended. So I suppose to address that on the Bytes side, there are a number of different workshops that we can offer. Underneath one of the Microsoft compliance workshops that we do, we can, do exactly that. We can actually start building out those recommendations. We can start looking at doing things like data risk checks within your organization, but effectively help you with the plan and strategy of DLP, because there are so many moving parts of it. So if you do require any support or assistance, a workshop is absolutely something that we can support and assist with. But that's not the only thing. There are loads of different areas and different things that Bytes can do. If it just comes down to having a one-to-one conversation with myself and Bruce, we can facilitate that. We've of course got the whole of the security and Microsoft teams that sit behind us. So any support and assistance that is of course required, please do feel free to reach out to either your account manager or tell me more at bytes.co.uk, where we'll be able to further support from there. I've seen a couple of questions come through on the chat. So of course this concludes the content that we had today. So let me just dig out the chat messages and scroll through them. There was one that I saw that was actually particularly interesting, and I was probably kicking it around in my head for a good 10 minutes as he was going through your bits, Bruce. So yeah, so the first question that's come through is, from the clients that we've spoken to, what is generally implemented first? Is it more of the service side controls or the client side controls? Now, before you answer that, Bruce, I'm gonna take a slight stab at this, and then you can tell me that I'm completely wrong and correct it all of the way. But from my experience, the client side, from my experience on the Microsoft side, client side was, especially a while back, the only really way forward when it came to DLP, right? And we're talking, let's classify that document on the endpoint, let's wrap in a policy to that, and let's protect that. So Azure Information Protection, P1 and P2 comes to mind. Now, of course, a lot of people generally got a little bit scared off around that, because that was, quite a big project. You would have to determine the automation side versus, letting the users classify their own documents. But now seeing what we've gone through today, we've got the service side pieces. So, things that go to Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive. I suppose from my side, it feels like you would be able to hit the ground running quite quickly on the service side functionality, but like the full-on protection is going to be at the data level, the client side piece. So that's the way that I would see it. I think both of them need to be implemented ultimately. I think it's more of the short term versus long term, but again, Bruce, feel free to absolutely throw me under the bus and tell me that I'm completely wrong. I think you're on mute. Pound in the jar.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so certainly agree with you there. You know, setting up DLP policies on the server side is certainly a lot easier than trying to define and implement information protection labeling strategy, and a bit less intrusive from an end user perspective, I guess. But you know, we've seen customers, especially once they started to adopt things like Teams, start to look at DLP, and then also found that it's from an Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive perspective, that's low-hanging fruit. Let's get in some of those defaults, sort of out-the-box ones that you can leverage from Microsoft side of things. So look at those ones for financial information, personal information, apply them across Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and that gives you a good sort of base, to protect those services. And then start to look at, the other components like Teams DLP to protect messages or information in those areas. And then, once you add Endpoint DLP, you just sort of open up a whole nother sort of area that you can start to protect from, right? And so I think, obviously DLP is kind of, you're trying to catch all this data from slipping through the net, right? So you set up and create these policies. You'll get false positives, you'll get negative positives or negative information happening. And so you can only make your policies as good as you can to hopefully catch most of that information. But when you start to implement that with client-side information protection and sensitivity labels, obviously that's where hopefully the end user knows a bit more about that data. And so if they've labeled that in the right way to label the content, encrypt it, then you're going to be protected far more as well, because you're not relying on a specific regular expression or sensitive info type. You have somebody who knows the data and they're protecting that information. So having a good strategy on both ends certainly will be the best approach here.
Well, and that's the way that I've always seen it, especially in the world of Microsoft. Is it's all around ecosystem, right? It's not about looking at just one part. It's after you look at multiple areas of Microsoft, they start joining up together. And when you was running through your part on the endpoint side, it's very closely joined to things like Defender for Endpoint. So and also MCAS will start throwing around the alerts. So it's very tightly knit. It's joined together. It's ecosystem based more so than anything. Yeah. Awesome. So looking through on the chat messages for the next question. So would these features work for non-Microsoft files? I think this was sent when you was doing your piece, Bruce.
Yeah. So I mean, certainly, obviously, the from an endpoint activities perspective, it'll match across obviously the Office documents and Adobe PDF files and TXT files. There's a list of specific extensions that it supports. So it's not every type of file that's going to match and monitor those activities on from an endpoint perspective. So certainly it's not only the Microsoft stuff. And there's the common ones obviously are there, and the big ones we see obviously are Office documents and PDF files, and certainly covers those. But there's a list of the specific extensions that are supported as part of the DLP policies.
Perfect. I suppose the general answer is all of the more standard documents that we'll see are going to be supported. It's not just going to be the Microsoft only, docx, PBTX, all of those types of files. It's it's quite broad, but at the same time not going to cover absolutely everything out there. Perfect. So another question. This is quite an interesting one, and whoever asked it, we're not going to be able to answer it today, but it will probably segue off into maybe another session, which is what M365 license is required to be able to set and define DLP policies. Now, if we start getting into this, it will probably be another hour, which I know that a lot of you probably don't have. The DLP components of Microsoft, they're pretty scattered across the M365 stack, right? Some of them are within the Office 365 part, the Azure Information Protection part, that's within your EM&S section. So some of them are dotted around the place for lack of a better expression. don't want to get into the weeds of licensing today. However, like what we can do is, and if anyone else is interested in more of the licensing side, we can run a one-to-one session to do pretty much two things. One is to actually run through the licensing and what's included, but also taking those individual components apart. Goes without saying that what Bruce took us through today is a combination of different DLP components that are across the licensing stack, right? So if that is of course of interest, we can pick it up with you individually. Please feel free to either ping us on the chat, reach out to your account manager, or come back to tell me more at bytes.co.uk, and we'll do an individual session. The main reason being is because it can't be explained in a mere matter of minutes. It will take a little bit of time.
I mean, I guess just quick one on that. You know, like you say, there's many ways to slice and dice to get the features, but at a high level, SharePoint Exchange and OneDrive, minimum of E3. So if you're on an E1, for example, you're not going to be able to do DLP. So E3 in Office 365 at a minimum for SharePoint Exchange and OneDrive. For Teams and for endpoints and for MCAS and on-prem repositories, then you're looking at E5. But like you say, there's so many different ways that you can purchase that.
And that's the thing, there's different ways to slice the SKUs and the suites, and you know, and that's the thing. It's, you know, there are options to go fully 5. There's also almost interim options if we don't need everything from E5, and that's, you know what, I think we've spent too much time on this already.
Yeah,
please reach out to us, individual session. We'll demystify the Microsoft licensing, which always sounds like a bit of an impossible task, but we'll definitely manage. Another question that came through was, can the pop-up be customized with a link to education, i.e. training links? So I think that would be either the toast notification or the notification that pops up within Teams.
Yeah, I guess obviously the notification, the policy tip that they get, where it shows, you know, like for example in Teams, when I hit the what can I do piece, it gives you that custom text that you can put in. So as part of your Dlp policy, you can add the custom policy tip that's going to show up from an end user perspective, and I guess you could put in a URL in there. I haven't tested it if it's going to make it a hyperlink as well, but you know, something you can try out and see what happens, I guess.
Awesome. And for the final question, which is maybe a little bit more of an open question, so we can definitely take a stab at it, but it is, I've just clicked off and now I've lost the question. Are we seeing more clients taking a focus on DLP? I suppose to start this one off, my answer is yes, definitely in the last, I would say 6 to 9 months. I would say typically on the Microsoft side, a lot of the conversations I was getting involved in was always around Azure Active Directory, Premium, and Intune being the main ones. A little bit of Defender for Endpoints here and there. That's, you know, definitely increased. DLP was always on, I don't know, I want to say the back of people's minds. This is talking, you know, 9 months plus ago. I think now a lot of the conversations we are having is around DLP and the capabilities within Microsoft. And I think that's for 2 reasons. One, you know, we've got the whole COVID, work from home, where is my data, you know, what is the risk? But also I think, you know, a lot of businesses now have actually rolled out Azure Active Directory, Premium, and Intune. So it's what's next in line, the data part. So that's what I'm seeing. I don't know, Bruce, if you've seen anything different, similar, the same?
Yeah, I'm seeing pretty much the same. Lots of conversations now around, I guess lots of users started to adopt things like Teams, and maybe they restricted collaboration in Teams so that they could just do meetings and chat. And now, you know, looking to open up collaboration, and obviously that then leverages SharePoint and OneDrive, and so lots of concern then around what's going to happen to this data, where's it going to go, what is it, where is it? And so lots of conversations around how you can ensure that you're protecting the content that's getting put up into these services. And so there's lots of, obviously, that discussion around information protection, DLP, lots of discussions around that lately, indeed.
Perfect. And I think one extra question has come in. which is what endpoints are supported with Endpoint Dlp.
Yeah, so for Endpoint Dlp specifically, obviously it's a Windows 10 endpoint thing at the moment. So I'm assuming Windows 11 will be supported when that comes out as well, but at the moment it's just Windows 10. I'm not sure. Hopefully they might add some additional components to that at a later stage, but for now it's Windows 10.
Perfect. I think that is it for questions. Thank you so much for all of you that hanged on for an extra 10 minutes. Hopefully you found this session useful. As mentioned, if you do have any further questions, if you do require any kind of support, please do reach out to us. Otherwise, again, thank you for joining. Have a lovely day. We'll hopefully speak to you soon. Thank you.